Welcome to the second lecture on lifespan development. Today we're going to be focused on two topics. It'll be genetics as well as prenatal development. Although across the semester we will be taking mostly a topical approach to development across the life cycle. This week's lecture is really going to focus more on both genetics and prenatal development and how the two are very intimately connected to each other. It's difficult to talk about genetics without also looking at especially prenatal development. So those will be our two main topics today for this week's lecture. So it's in the genes. Here are some interesting data points, if you will, about genetics. Humans have approximately 100,000 distinct genes. Genes are made up of chemical codes of four bases, and the ways that these four are combined in a DNA strand of 23 pairs of chromosomes provides instructions for the body's development and functioning. Genes accomplish two main things. They ensure genetic continuity, that is, the genes that are available from both the parents are passed on to the next generation, and because of the numerous ways that DNA strands can develop, that is, there are 8 million possible combinations of chromosomes possible. Across the species, there is this diversity as well that is ensured within the species. Twins are particularly of interest to researchers, especially for development, around issues of development. 1 in 60 pregnancies are dizygotic twins. That means that these are fraternal twins. They develop from two separate eggs, and they're essentially two siblings that happen to be born. They're like any other two siblings, but they just happen to be born at the same time. However, 1 in 270 pregnancies is monozygotic or identical. Why are twins so important in research? Because the use of monozygotic twins in research helps, at least in some ways, to differentiate between genetics and environmental influences in human development. Most traits, whether those be physical, personality characteristics of the individual, etc., in human beings are polygenetic, which involves a combination of genes. In fact, I just was at a international research conference where they were talking about the genetic influences for schizophrenia, a major mental health disorder, and not only were they talking about it being polygenic, but they were talking in the thousands of genes that might be involved with causing a person to be vulnerable to schizophrenia later in their lives. So when we say polygenetic, we're not just talking about 2 or 3 more, although in some cases it could only be just 2 or 3. We could be talking up into the thousands, as well as multifactorial. Again, talking about human traits, that it is multifactorial. Polygenetic, multifactorial. What is meant by that is that there are many physiological as well as social environmental influences. So when we talk about the environment, remember we talked about person and environment. The person in this case we could think of as the genetics that are there, the polygenetic combinations that can occur in any one individual that creates all sorts of different physiological developmental occurrences or situations or developments, what have you, are then also impacted by multifactorial, influences in the environment. And the environment in this case can be both the physical environment as well as the social environment. Okay, another thing, just to kind of give you some basic background about genetics, is the idea of dominant and recessive processes. The combination of several genes, where one or more gene has greater influence over how a trait is expressed. So if a gene has more influence over other genes that are part of a combination, such let's say a polygenetic combination, and that has more influence as to whether a particular trait is expressed, that is considered a dominant gene, compared to the other genes, in this case, would be considered recessive if they do not have a dominant influence. Polygenic and interactive genetics effects are particularly apparent in psychological characteristics, believe it or not. And we will talk about this we will talk a little bit about it in this lecture, but we will also talk about it in future lectures about how the personality of an individual has physiological components to its expression in that individual. And again, once again, remember that environment refers to both the physical environment, in this case it could be mothers smoking during pregnancy, and social cultural, the many cultural ways that babies or even pregnancies are dealt with. These are all environmental factors that are instrumental in genetic expression. So, behavior genetics, single gene, polygenetic, multifactorial, additive, X-linked. These are all different ways in which genetics are expressed. Maybe 100 years ago, 50 years ago is probably more accurate, people were still thinking of along the lines of one gene being important in the expression of, let's say, a particular disease process. But now they're realizing that, in fact, most things are polygenetic and multifactorial. There's also an additive process that refers to that when you have more than one gene involved, different types of gene involved, they each add further to how the how the genetics will be expressed in the individual. We already talked about dominant, recessive, X-linked. This is a special case of the dominant recessive process in which the recessive gene is primarily on the X chromosome. Given that males only have one X chromosome, that means that recessive traits are more likely to be expressed in males than females, because females obviously have two X chromosomes. Therefore, one X chromosome can have a dominant gene that then suppresses the expression of the recessive gene trait. This is also expressed in childhood diseases. In fact, there is some research to suggest that male children historically have been more vulnerable to certain disease processes because they only have one X chromosome as opposed to female children. Okay, so let's move in with that kind of a basis in genetics, very brief overview in genetics as our basis. Let's talk about the three phases of prenatal development. There's the germinal period, the embryonic period, and then the fetal period. The germinal period is essentially the first 2 weeks of development. Fertilization occurs, and it is a one-celled zygote. And this zygote, or fertilized ovum, begins the process of what is called differentiation. That is, the genetic code within the cells releases proteins that instruct or compel or propel the cell, the undifferentiated cells, I should say, to begin to specify specific form and specific function. At this phase, the main differentiation is between an outer placenta and the inner nucleus of cells that eventually develop into the infant. Also, it is this period that creates so much controversy regarding stem cell research. Generally, this form of research, that is stem cell research, extracts undifferentiated cells from a 5 to 7 day old pre-embryonic group of cells, which does destroy these pre-embryonic cells in the process. But again, stem cell research primarily, at least the form of stem cell research that was so controversial a number of years ago, deals with the germinal period at 5 to 7 days. The embryonic period lasts from approximately 3 to 9 weeks. Differentiation of cell now involves the following. There's a neural tube, which eventually becomes the brain, the spinal cord, and eventually the full nervous system. There's cardiovascular system, which begins to develop and function. The hen begins to take on a bit of shape with the inclusion of eyes, a budding nose, budding ears, and a budding mouth. There is very basic arm and leg buds that appear, and then most embryos weigh approximately 1/30th of an ounce and are about 1 inch long. And the slide I have here really gives you a good example of what the embryo is like during this period. Then this is the period that most people are familiar with, and this is the fetal period, and this lasts approximately from 10 weeks to birth. During this period, there is formation of the sex organs, and these begin and finish, and this process, I should say, finishes in this phase. There's full formation of the basic central nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, arms and legs, etc., throughout pretty much most of the rest of the body, I should say, up until the point of birth. I should say that although the brain is essentially developed by birth, the brain continues to grow and develop postpartum for the next year to 2 years of the child's life. And then there is what they call the age of viability. The age of viability deals with the idea of whether a fetus can survive outside of the womb or not. Brain maturation reaches a point wherein it can essentially regulate some very basic bodily functions of breathing, sleeping, sucking outside of the womb. Viability is that legal medical term where a pregnancy can be terminated or not by law, because this is the stage in development wherein abortion becomes illegal to perform due to the issue of viability and other concerns due to medical complications. So if you look at viability at, let's say, 23 weeks, the survival percentage, that is those fetuses outside of the uterus, if they survive, it's only about 16%. If you go to 24 weeks, it's about 20%. 25 weeks we're getting up to about 50%. 26 weeks, 67%. 27 weeks, about 90% survive, and by 29 weeks we're getting up to about 100%. So if you look between 23 and 26 weeks, that's how much development occurs for the fetus in utero. So that even 1 week can cause a difference between 15 to 30% survivability rate. Okay. So another very important idea in the scientific study of prenatal development is the notion of birth defects, and that a child is born with a particular physiological problem or defect, as they say. And typically these can be caused by toxins or teratogens or conditions within the womb, or the uterus, I should say, that can impact the development of the fetus. Examples of these are viruses, bacteria, drugs that the mother consumes, etc. Whether this toxin has an impact on, or how it has an impact on the developing fetus, really depends on the timing of the exposure, the amount of the exposure, is it brief or is it prolonged, and then the genetic vulnerability to that particular exposure or teratogen. For some fetuses, the exposure to a virus would have little to no impact on them. other fetuses may have a genetic vulnerability to that virus, let's say, and therefore there may be more of an impact. Every system in the developing fetus during the embryonic stage has a critical period. There's a critical period for the eyes. There's a critical period for the limbs, for the cardiovascular system, etc. So if that particular system is developing or is having rapid development or change, and there is exposure to a particular kind of bacteria, toxin, what have you, that particular system is more vulnerable to the toxin. The critical period for the brain and the nervous system is essentially the entire pregnancy, as well as during the first years of life. So the nervous system and the brain are actually always vulnerable to toxins. Thus, the brain and nervous system is the most complex and the most vulnerable part of the body to damage. Major toxins from parents can be alcohol and drug abuse, HIV infection, although that can be controlled with medical treatment, low birth weight. Males tend to have higher rates of teratogen-related birth defects than females. And male fetuses tend to be spontaneously aborted at higher rates, probably due to the above situation. This also might be related to the XY chromosome issue that I described above. The birthing process. The quality of the birth process depends on many factors for the infant. The mother's preparation for the process, the physical support for the mother and the newborn during the pregnancy as well as the birth and just post-birth, the emotional support for the mother and the newborn, both, not just the mother, the position and the size of the fetus, too few or too many medical procedures depending on the needs of the mother and the newborn. Birth complications also tend to be due to what was discussed before. Early delivery in the pregnancy process, low birth weight, which we will get to in a moment, genetic abnormalities, teratogenic exposure. The mother is very young, that is before the age of 16, or older, post 40 years of age. Or the mother is ill during her pregnancy or is small. All of these can influence the birthing process and can impact the development of the infant post-birth or postpartum. Low birth weight, what can influence low birth weight? First of all, low birth weight is defined as an infant that is born and weighs less than 5.5 pounds. What impacts low birth weight, or what can make a child vulnerable to low birth weight, is poverty, smoking and drug use by the mother, stressful living conditions. And when we talk about stressful living conditions, we're not talking about everyday stress. We're talking prolonged, intense, even traumatizing stress for the mother. A genetic predisposition. Some children are more predisposed to being smaller than others. Prenatal infections, malnutrition of the mother, little to no prenatal care. All of these can influence whether a child is born with low birth weight, that is less than 5.5 pounds. The reason why low birth weight is important is because if a child is born with a low birth weight, the child is more vulnerable to infections, diseases. There may be less development in different parts of the body than if the child had been, had weighed more and had developed further before birth. So low birth weight can create numerous vulnerabilities for the infant postpartum. Okay, so we did talk, I'm now going to kind of reverse back. We talked about the whole prenatal period, a very brief overview, and the readings will provide you with more information about that prenatal period. So please make sure that you look at that. But I now want to turn to this whole issue of genetics and environment, which I talked about briefly at the beginning of the lecture. Epigenetic theory is an approach to genetics that essentially takes into account the physiological and social environment and its influence on genetic expression. And what I mean by genetic expression is that just because a person has certain genes, let's say, doesn't mean necessarily those what is in those genes, so to speak, will be expressed. That is, will occur. The vast majority of what is in the genetic code, of course, does occur. That's what prompts the development during the prenatal process. But not everything necessarily is expressed during that process or by the time of birth. And the environment can be very influential as to which genetic features, first of all, are expressed, and secondly, how strongly or weakly they are expressed. Really, the epigenetic theory views development as the result of an ongoing bidirectional interchange between heredity, that is genes, and the environment. And again, when we talk about environment, we're talking about both physical and social elements of the environment, which can include such things as parenting, family dynamics, schooling, the quality of the neighborhood, the physical quality of the neighborhood, how healthy is the neighborhood, viruses, as well as, if we're going to really talk about social influences, culture. How does culture influence certain, the birthing process, the raising of children, particularly infants in this case? Since the epigenetic theory relies on, that is, takes into account, I should say, the environment, which can vary across culture, heredity therefore can be somewhat influenced by these cultural environmental influences. Another thing I should also mention is the whole issue of socioeconomic status, which can aid environmental influences such as access to healthy foods, access to medical care, prompt medical care, especially in cases of emergency, to preventative medical care, to medicines in general, etc. So the epigenetic theory accepts, or is a study, I should say, of genetics, while taking into account that the environment can have an influence on the expression of genetics, how strong, how weak, etc. certain genetic characteristics are expressed. A good example of the epigenetic theory is the idea of the universality of gender roles. What epigenetic theory proposes is that there is probably some genetic and physiological differences at a very basic level between males and females. This has been recognized within human cultures on some very basic level. Now we're going back thousands of years ago, and certain roles, certain norms may be attributed to females, to males, and these expectations of the environment can therefore influence the further expression of differences between, let's say, boys and girls. Why do they say that? Because of the continuing brain development that occurs early in life, especially in the first 5 to 7 years. Although brain development continues after that into adolescence, the brain is particularly malleable to the impact of the environment to the family, to caretaking, interactions with the caretaker, etc., which may emphasize certain differences between, let's say, male children and female children. So, for example, for males, the right hemisphere neural activity is more pronounced. This might account for why boys tend to be better with spatial representation, mathematics, logic. Boys also tend to be more physically active than girls, even as infants. And so there may be, maybe across generations and generations, cultures begin to assume that for the vast majority of male children, this is how they will be. Their behavior, that is the culture's behavior and norms, impact what is encouraged by the child to do, what it may be discouraged for the child to do because it's not anticipated that the child will do that. And therefore, that in and of itself can impact brain development. That is, boys' brains at very early ages may develop even further in the right hemisphere neural activity because these brains are being encouraged by the environment to behave in behaviors that can encourage further development in that area of the brain. So there is this idea that there is a universality of gender roles across time and across cultures. However, despite that there is this universality of gender roles, what those roles are at any given time in history and in any given culture can be substantially different from another culture's expectations about what boys do, what girls do, etc. So the idea is that the social environment responds to the developing child based on that child's level of ability. If girls tend to develop reading and writing skills faster, let's say on average, then the social environment may tend to reinforce those skills, which in turn further enhances the development of those areas of the brain. Thus, social, cultural, and native brain development are they both inadvertently reinforce each other. That's the example that they give in epigenetic theory. Another theory I want to focus on is social systems theory. There is what is called general systems theory, which actually started in biology. I don't know, maybe 70 years ago now, when we're talking about this. Social systems theory is taking what was thought of in biology from general systems theory and applying it to social environmental situations. Social systems theory is the application of general systems theory, which was primarily and initially focused on biological and mechanical systems. Social systems can be as small as a dyad between a caregiver and a child, let's say, or as large as international relations. So this can include all sorts of social systems. Here are some basic terminology that is used in social systems theory. You will see some of this in our readings, and you will certainly see some of this, and much of this, I should say, in some of your other courses. But this idea of systems theory was very influential in the development of epigenetics theory. So we have what are called system-environment boundaries between the system and the environment outside of the system. Information is the energy that comes into a social system. There's input, throughput, output. Input is the information or resources from an environment that come to a system. Throughput is how the system responds to that. And then the system creates output for the environment based on the initial information. By the way, this is just basic information for you to know. Feedback loops, we'll get into that in a moment. And then there's hierarchy of systems. Let me see if I get into that. Let me see. Yes, I do. Whoops. Oh, okay. Okay. Got a little lost there. I'm using an iPad, and you touch one part of the screen and it just suddenly blips out on you. Anyway, let's get to some of these ideas. Oops, sorry. Some of these ideas. Boundary. A boundary is located wherever the level of interchange is greater on one side of a certain point than on the other side. What this means is that when you look at a social system, you can tell that people are a part of the same social system because they tend to interact more with those who are part of the system than those who are not a part of the system. A good example of this is if you're in the mall. You can tell who are couples. You can tell who are friends, group of teenagers, let's say, that are in the mall. You can tell who are friends because they interact with each other. There's a lot of energy and interchange between them. And if somebody, a stranger, were to approach this group or this couple or a family, let's say, they might look a little suspicious, a little like strange, odd, not quite sure how to respond to the stranger because the stranger is coming from outside of this interchange or social system. Boundaries can be described as open or closed or permeable and dense. There may be some social systems that are more permeable, that is more welcoming. There's a freer interchange of those who are in the system and those who are out of the system. And then there are some systems that can be very closed. Boundaries are never completely open or completely closed, or else there would be no system, because a system always needs an environment in order to survive. This is true both for a physical system. Let's say if you were to look at an animal in an ecological environment, that animal, although a closed system in some ways, must interact with its system in order to survive. That's also true, according to social systems theory, for social systems. So we refer to boundaries as being relatively more open, that is permeable, or relatively more closed or dense. Okay? Information in the physical sciences, at whatever level, they use energy for the purposes of the functioning of the system. This could be resources, food, light, what have you. Of course, these are all still important to even social systems, but there can also be social resources that come into the system. There can be prestige, there can be financial resources that come in, there can be more informal resources. There may be a group maybe calls in an expert to come in and help them with a particular problem. So this is the information that comes in from outside of the system, I should say, from the environment to help the system function. Input, again, is this energy, information, or resources that comes to that particular system. Output is whatever leaves the system back into the environment. Output is in general different from the input. The system is not just a passive tube, but an active processor. So even if, let's say, money comes into, let's say, a business, that money is used to maybe buy supplies, pay workers, etc. And then the output is very different from the money that actually came into the system. Okay? Throughput is basically what the system does with the input within the system itself. Okay? It's the process within the system that uses the information or resources. In order to speak about the inside and the outside of a system, we need to be able to distinguish between the system itself and its environment. And this gets into the notion of boundary, which we've already talked about before. Boundaries, again, is that place where things from the environment come into the system, cross the boundary into the system uses the information, that's the throughput, or the resources, I should say, that's the throughput, and then sends out new resources, sometimes waste, sometimes information, out back into the environment, crosses the boundary of the system into the environment. That's your output. Feedback loops is basically the common interchange that occurs between a system and its environment. These are patterned interchanges that consistently occur over and over again. It feeds it into itself. So the environment provides resources to a system. The system uses those resources in a particular way, creates an output that the environment is expecting. The environment then responds with the same kinds of resources again. A good example of a feedback loop is real-time rating systems for television programs, where, for example, if you watch a shopping network, and not that I've ever done this myself, by the way, and they're selling a particular item, and they say you've only got 5 more minutes to buy the item. But they notice from the information that they're getting from the sales that lots of people are calling in. This is input into the TV network. This is input from the environment. Oh, look, lots of people are buying our product. That's information for them to use. They use that information to then say, okay, we'll continue to sell this product because we're selling lots of them. As soon as those sales numbers start to go down, which is new information, the product that was being sold is pulled for a new product. Okay, so this is a feedback loop. They sell an item, they get input from the environment, more sales, more sales, more sales. The sales start to go down, people are not calling in as much. That's new information. They put up a new product to then create even more interest and get more people to call in again for the new item. This is a feedback loop. Hierarchy of systems basically deals with the idea that there are smaller systems contained within larger systems. We're not going to get into this a lot, but let's say a baby is a system of a larger system of a family. The family is a system in a larger system of a neighborhood, and a neighborhood is a system within a larger system called the city. This is a hierarchy of systems. Again, we're not going to get into that for our purposes. Yeah, I think that's all we need to get into about that. Our last topic is around personality. And I really like, the reason why I wanted to introduce the idea of personality to you during this lecture is not only will we, like I said earlier, look at this again later in the semester, but it's a good example of an individual's example of genetics and social systems. Let's put it that way. Personality is that pattern, I should say, of characteristic thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that distinguishes one person from another, and that persists, that is the pattern of characteristics, persists over time and situation. It is the sum of biologically based and learnt behaviors which form the person's unique responses to environmental stimuli. So the idea is that each person has a physiological basis to their personality. That's what principally causes, especially in the beginning of the person's life, this consistency across time and across situations. Then, with different kind of learning experiences from interactions with the social environment, let's say the personality is filled out a little bit more. The traits it's not just traits now, but it's now a more fully formed idea, sense of self. Okay? This too but this is also, I should say, based on the traits. The traits are kind of the foundation of the personality, and then the social experiences across time are kind of the house that is built on top of those traits. The foundation is always about the same. Sometimes the house can change across time. The personality structure, though, per research, is fairly stable and predictable throughout different situations and time. There are personality traits of different depth and significance. The innermost layer is the basic, while the outermost layer of a personality is situation-bound and influenced by the environment. This is the part of the personality that's more permeable, shall we say, and malleable. Example, a tired person might accordingly behave in a way that is not like his or her true self. That's an example where a social circumstance, fatigue from a long day at work, the demands of taking care of a family, working full-time, can cause the person to behave in ways that are not characteristic for that individual. So the social environment can actually influence how the person behaves. The impact of events and feelings during the lifespan only affect the surface, not the core personality. But there can be profound changes in personality, even at the very core, due to major life changes or deliberate, intensive efforts to change on the part of the individual. So what am I talking about? Probably the one trait most people are familiar with that probably has a strong physiological, even genetic component is the idea of being introverted or extroverted. So a person essentially tends to be more outwardly focused, more energized, let's say, by what is outside, that's not in the interior of the individual, but what's happening outside of the environment, and those who are more focused on the interior life of the person, they may tend to shy away from lots of activity, lots of noise, lots of energy, etc. And there is research to show that even at birth, I shouldn't say at birth, at infancy, basically, during those very first months of life, one can see a difference between those who eventually develop into a more extroverted personality and those who develop into a more introverted personality. So that suggests that there is a genetic component or genetics. There are components from genes that are a part of that personality. But then culture comes along, family life comes along, life experiences come along, which may force the individual to be maybe a little bit more introverted or a little bit more extroverted, despite what their basic characteristics are. That rounds out the personality. So a person who's very introverted can be extroverted when he needs to be. Okay? A person who's very introverted is able to be very a person who's very extroverted is able to be very introverted when she needs to be, okay? Based on the social demands, circumstances, etc. Okay, that is our lecture for this week. Please remember that there are 2 videos that that are available for this week. One is regarding understanding Down syndrome, and one is regarding autism caused by genes or the environment, whereas epigeneticists might say, or both. Thank you for listening.